First of all, I would like to thank Professor Matsui and the other organizers of this event for inviting me to speak at the symposium. We had a very interesting visit to the Tohoku area on Wednesday, and we were inspired by the remarkable recovery that has happened in this very short time. What I would like to talk about today is how we can use a classic public health approach to prepare for natural disasters. The principle that I want to focus on is the power of primary prevention. Primary prevention is usually used to help keep bad things from happening to a group of people. For example, you might administer a flu vaccine to prevent an epidemic, or you might establish policies for safe food and water handling. Those are sort of classic uses of this principle. And it's certainly understood that it is better for everyone involved if you can keep people healthy, keep them from suffering and being sick. It will cost less money, there will be less suffering, and in the end, everyone is better off for that. So you might look at this idea and think, how can we possibly use this to deal with something as unpredictable and uncontrollable as a natural disaster? Unless one of us is secretly a superhero, none of us can prevent a storm or an earthquake. However, what we can do is employ the idea of primary prevention as we develop disaster plans. This approach can help keep some disasters from happening in the first place and help mitigate or minimize the effects of others. The primary prevention approach requires us to take a longer view. We must consider what we can do years or even decades in advance to help minimize the impact of these inevitable natural occurrences. A good example of a country that uses the strategy of primary prevention is the Netherlands. So much of the land of the Netherlands is actually below sea level. And so they've developed over the years variable systems of dikes that help protect the land. But inevitably, storms would occur and the dikes would fail. So here's a drawing from about 350 years ago showing the breach of a dike near Amsterdam, and you can see the villages and the towns on the other side of the dike are being flooded. So this kind of disaster happened again and again over the centuries in the Netherlands. And then in 1953, soon after World War II, a major storm destroyed 89 dikes and resulted in the deaths of 1,800 people. This cataclysmic event moved the Dutch government to take stronger action to protect the land and their people. What's very notable about their response is that they were very rational in their analysis and in their decision-making around how to prevent the threat of flooding. What they realized was that while they couldn't prevent the storm from happening in the first place, what they could do is reduce the impact of the storms by making a major investment in the dikes. And this is what they came up with. It's called the Delta Works. And it's this sophisticated system of dike rings and dams and pumps and locks and other things. And it's considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. It's a very impressive sight. And here you can see the results of those efforts. This is the dike ring system. That has been set up. So all these areas that are surrounded by red are areas that are protected by the dikes. And there's a color code over here on the left that shows the expected effectiveness of these dikes. So this area that's dark pink here only expects to be flooded once every 10,000 years. That's very good protection. Even the least protected areas, the ones that are shaded in green, only expect to be flooded once every 1,250 years. So they've got a very good system here. But nonetheless, they're not resting on their accomplishments. They're currently in the process of making a 200-year plan to maintain and upgrade the system, taking into account the expected sea level changes that will occur with climate change. This reflects a long-sighted approach, one over many, many decades, that has involved a big investment, not in preventing storms, but in preventing the consequences of storms. In deciding how to build these dikes, the Dutch applied careful economic analysis. On the horizontal axis of this graph, you can see the height in dikes. And then, of course, building a dike or raising a dike costs money, so along the side we have the money. Most of the dikes at the time they began this project, again in the 1950s, were already about 3 feet high. So most of the expense was in raising them above 3 feet. And you can see as you build it higher and higher, the expense goes up and up. The unit over here is guilders. And to convert to euros, you need to divide by roughly 2. So you can see that a really good dike system costs about 2,000 million guilders, or about 2 billion, or euros, or about 1 billion euros. So that's a lot of money. And we can see from this, therefore, the cost of building higher dikes. However, there is also a cost of doing nothing. What is the cost of not building the dikes? That's why we have this other line that estimates the cost that would be involved in cleaning up the cities and rebuilding them, repairing farmland so that it can be farmed again after a catastrophic flood. While they did put a value on human lives, about 2 million guilders, it's clear that the human impact goes far beyond that. So, we don't mean to quantify something that's clearly unquantifiable. But here is this other thing. So clearly, if you don't raise the dikes above 3 feet, you're inviting a damaging and expensive and traumatic flood. Now this third line is the sum of the first two. And here you can see where both, the point at which both risk and expense are minimized, meeting in the middle. And where you can build effective barriers that protect the land, but also don't cost too much money. So this suggests that building a dike that's about 4.5 meters high is a kind of optimum, balancing risk and cost. The rational thinking that the Dutch have applied to this problem and their success in preventing floods stands in contrast to stories that we have heard about other recent disasters. And that leads us to ask this question: how do these various protective strategies fail? So I've come up with sort of 4 scenarios, 2 of which I'm going to go into some depth about. The first is when protection is inadequate for a really predictable natural disaster, something that we already know that is high risk, and the failure to plan an effective strategy to protect the population. A good example here is Hurricane Katrina, and I'll return to that after a moment. But I wanted to briefly mention a related problem, which is the unintended consequences that can arise from poorly executed interventions. A good example here is the building of levees along the Mississippi River. These levees are designed to cut off the floodplains from the river so that developers can build on the land and the people who live there can feel protected. However, these floodplains are important wetlands. In addition to being vibrant ecosystems, they also serve as buffer zones, holding excess water in the rare years when the spring and summer floods are higher than expected. What we saw in the catastrophic Mississippi floods of 1993 was that without this buffer zone, water levels rose above the levees and resulted in a flood much more devastating than would have occurred had the floodplains been left intact. In fact, some of the levees that were protecting the less populated areas, the farmland, were intentionally destroyed, giving the water a place to run so that it didn't flood the cities along the river. A third scenario, which I'll also return to, is when you can encounter such an extreme challenge that it can overwhelm a well-designed system. And that's certainly my impression of the Great East Japan earthquake. And then finally, it's important to consider human factors in all of these scenarios. If protections are very good, or if warnings are issued too frequently, people sometimes feel complacent and don't heed the warnings. We see this a lot when there is an evacuation order in advance of a hurricane, although we see it less after Hurricane Katrina because people really got scared by that. But nonetheless, there's always a core of people who are just determined to wait out the storm, who feel that their house is very strong, the weather forecaster is exaggerating again, and that nothing bad will happen. In other cases, it is difficult for people to comprehend the potential for devastation. I've heard that on the day before the Great East Japan earthquake, there had been some smaller earthquakes and some tsunamis that measured less than 1 meter in height. And because these earlier events were not so bad, some people did not evacuate as quickly as they should have on March 11th. Now let me return to the problem of inadequate preparation for a well-known threat and the story of Hurricane Katrina. Now, this event was entirely predictable. In fact, as I was preparing for this talk, I met with Professor Joe Brain from my department, who is also interested in this subject, and he gave me an article from the Scientific American magazine called The Drowning of New Orleans. When I looked at it, I thought, oh, this must be a summary of all the things that happened in August 2005 after this hurricane. But then I looked at the date, and the date was August 2001. So even 4 years before Hurricane Katrina, someone had written a complex article outlining a scenario that is very largely what happened in Katrina, although fortunately the end result was not quite as bad as they had predicted. Here are some photos of what happened during Hurricane Katrina. Sometimes New Orleans is described as a bathtub. It's surrounded by these levees, but like Amsterdam and the rest of the Netherlands, it's largely below sea level. So as soon as those levees broke, water quickly flooded into the city, and within a very short time, people were, in this case, up to their necks in water. But even inside people's homes, they had to climb to the second floor and sometimes out to the roof in order to escape the water. Here's a picture of the downtown flooded. Here's the sports arena, which ultimately served as the major evacuation center. Here's another community completely flooded. These are the roofs of houses. So clearly, this neighborhood is heavily damaged. So you look at this and you say, so what happened to New Orleans? Was this disaster caused by Hurricane Katrina? I would have to say that the answer to this question is no. It was not caused by the hurricane. And in fact, it was caused by the failure to make the appropriate investments over past decades. If we want to prevent disasters or mitigate them, effects of them, we need to make appropriate investments. I am not sure what it would have cost to build the levees to sufficient heights and strengths, but I'm certain it would have been far less than the ultimate price of the disaster, which is thought to be at least $110 billion, possibly as much as 150 or 160. So like New Orleans, like the Netherlands, has a history of floods. So again, this was somewhat of a predictable event. Most notably, Hurricane Betty struck New Orleans in 1965, causing severe flooding in the city and 76 deaths. At that time, improvements to the levee were proposed, and they were very quickly applied. Money was set aside initially. But unfortunately, the work on the project moved very slowly. And even 40 years later, when Hurricane Katrina struck, these improvements were still not complete. In addition, many of the levees were poorly designed, and some had been modified for other uses, such as a railway bridge. And so the result was a patchwork of structures of variable heights and materials. And so naturally, when the water rose, it simply found the weakest point and burst through. So here's one of the broken levees that surrounded New Orleans, and this is certainly not something you would mistake for a wonder of the modern world. The failure of the levees created an immediate crisis for the people who remained in New Orleans. While about 85% of the residents of the city evacuated ahead of the storm, which was a very good success story, those left behind included many older, disabled, and poor residents. About half of the people who died in this disaster were over the age of 70. Finally, over the long term, the community suffered greatly. In the aftermath of the storm, roughly a third of the population wound up relocating. Either they evacuated and never came back, or they left their home after their home was destroyed in the flood. And we're not quite sure how many people left, how many came back. Some new residents moved in to work on construction projects, but the thought is around 30% or so relocated. And the result is that we lost this really distinctive and old American culture. We can find similar stories told from disasters all around the world. Here's a picture of Haiti after the 2010 2010 earthquake, Port-au-Prince, just a mishmash of rubble of these poorly constructed houses. Here's the aftermath of the earthquake in Sichuan in 2008. A big problem here was that there were high standards for housing, but they were not followed in construction of housing or in public buildings. This is a primary school that collapsed. Next to it is a kindergarten which survived and a hotel. But many of the parents were outraged that the schools were not held to a higher standard of construction. This stands in contrast to the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami of March 2011. For one thing, the Japanese learned from prior experiences. So here's the Kobe earthquake of 1995. And in that earthquake, as you know, many of the deaths were the result of collapsed buildings. And this event caused research into building earthquake-proof structures and an increase in the standards of construction. Similarly, tsunamis have occurred in the past and have inspired the building of more extensive seawalls. Here's a picture of Kamaishi after the 1896 tsunami. And here's a picture of the Kamaishi seawall, which was completed in 2010, and after about 30 or 40 years of work, I believe. Many of the seawalls did fail, as of course you know, including this one in Kamaishi. Most worrisome, of course, is the breaching of the walls near the nuclear power plant in Fukushima. But you could argue that we were dealing with the extreme end of the dose response curve, where a lot more money would have been needed to prepare for, in this case, an earthquake of unprecedented strength. Despite the failure of these engineered systems, the human systems, for the most part, worked very well. People who live in areas that are vulnerable to tsunamis are trained how to escape from them, and most fled up well-established routes to higher ground. So what lessons can we learn from these experiences? And how do we then apply these public health principles to prepare for future disasters? First of all, in events like this and others, it's great to learn from each other and to use the best practices that have been developed on a global scale. Of course, Japan has great experience and knowledge about construction for earthquakes. California also has some of that. The Swiss with the Alps, of course, has experience with avalanches. The Netherlands, as we've talked about, knows all about floods. And France and other European countries have experience with forest fires. So we need to tap into that knowledge, that global knowledge, and put it to use wherever it's applicable. We also need to anticipate future risks, and these risks are increasing day by day by different things that humans are doing to the environment. First of all, of course, there's global climate change, which is going to require us to reevaluate flood risks, avalanche risks, and other types of risks. There's increasing concern about geologic disturbances as a result of human activities. For example, natural gas drilling has been linked to some pretty small earthquakes that have occurred in the middle part of the United States. And it is thought that dam building near a fault line in China may have been the cause of the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. And then thirdly, as the world becomes ever more urbanized, just by chance, some populations are accumulating in areas that are near fault lines. So for example, Istanbul, Turkey. I read those buildings are described by seismologists as pre-rubble, just waiting to collapse in an earthquake because they're not well constructed and so many people are living there. It's a tremendous threat. Lima, Peru is another city considered very vulnerable. People who live near oceans, Bangladesh is a good example, will be vulnerable to storms. Floodplains we've talked about, mountainsides vulnerable to mudslides like we saw in Kyushu not too long ago. So we need to be careful where populations are located and sometimes maybe need to relocate them. Thirdly, we need to adopt appropriate new technologies. And this, of course, is occurring in many different places and many different levels, and you all are contributing to much of it. We're getting better and better at modeling risks. Technology for buildings and dams and levees is always improving as well. And then communication systems, especially really resilient ones that can withstand a disaster, are increasingly becoming available. And these changes may cause us to reevaluate our strategies for prevention. For example, many cities along the Japan coast, as I understand it, are not necessarily wanting to rebuild the unattractive and very expensive seawall. Some are going to put their money into a better communication system to warn of dangers. And then finally, when a disaster does strike, we must commit ourselves to caring for the affected communities for years to come. As you all are very aware, these disasters take a very long time to recover from, and beyond the engineering and technical piece, there's the very human piece that is also important. Mental health concerns are important, particularly depression, which tends to be long-term for people after a disaster, and along with it goes an elevated suicide risk. Older people are especially vulnerable, and we need to take care to find them places that they can feel at home. And then finally, in order to keep us as a community in place, we need, and families to stay put, we need to be sure that we're meeting the needs of children so that they are having a school that is supportive and a home environment, housing where they can live, parks where they can play, so that they are places where families want to live. This picture is from Ishinomaki when I visited last fall with my son, John Henry. He kicked a soccer ball around with some fourth graders, and we were so thrilled to see these children smiling so soon after this horrible event. And my belief is that this is the future of Japan. Thank you.